here's someone who does the impossible. Yeah, it seems like that, but obviously it's not impossible if someone can accomplish it. And today, you might not be completely blind and wanting to get a gun permit. And we're glad about that. But you might be facing a situation that looks completely and utterly humanly impossible. My question is, how do you respond? How are you going to act when you come up against that situation? What is your response going to be? Is it going to be to give up in despair and frustration? Are you going to get mad and say that life's unfair? Or are you going to figure out a way to deal with the impossible? Today we're going to look at how that plays out in the book of Esther. We've been going through the book of Esther, and in Esther chapter 8, we're going to pick up and see how Esther and Mordecai dealt with an impossible situation. Some of you haven't been here, so just to review, Esther was an exile. She had been brought to the Persian Empire against her will. She was raised in the capital city, and when the king wanted a new queen, she was forced into a beauty contest, which she ended up winning, and she became the queen. And then the arch enemy shows up, and he plotted the death of not only the Jews in the capital city, but all Jews throughout the Persian Empire, which was the world empire at the time. So basically, it was genocide that Haman had planned, and it was written down. Haman had written this in the law of the Medes and Persians, and you're going to see in a little while. King Xerxes actually repeats it, but the laws of the kings or the Medes and Persians could never be changed. Once it was written and sealed with the king's ring, it could never be changed. It was impossible to change the law. And the law stated that in about 11 months, it was completely legal for anyone to kill any Jew and take whatever they wanted, end of story, and that was it. And this is the situation that Esther and her adopted father, Mordecai, were trying to deal with. And that's where we are as we begin chapter 8. And Haman has just been killed because he was found to be treacherous and trying to kill the queen. And so chapter 8 picks up this way. The same day that Haman was killed, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and she rose and stood before him. Verse 5, "If it pleases the king," she said, "if he regards me with favor and thinks it is the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, that the Agagite devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have hanged him on the gallows. Now, write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked." I want you to think about that right now, and we're going to just stop there as we go through this chapter, because we are given a really good understanding of the impossibilities that Esther and Mordecai were facing. The king himself, King Xerxes, said, "This isn't the law of the Medes and Persians. We cannot get rid of this." But you know what? Esther and Mordecai and us today, we serve the God of the impossible. He specializes in doing what can't be done, because nothing is impossible for God. And so when we face those situations, we need to turn to God. We need to say, "Hey, God, we can't do it. There's nothing we can do. We need you to step in and do the amazing and the miraculous." And that brings us to our first point this morning. That is, as we look at this, God overcoming impossibilities starts with changing hearts. It really does. It starts with changing hearts. Now, we need to be careful, because some of the hearts in this had changed in a very positive way. As we start reading the story, we see that the king had done away with the arch villain Haman, and he had taken his estate, his wealth, and he had given it to Esther, and Esther had turned around and given it to Mordecai. All of a sudden, Esther and Mordecai had been blessed by what's going on. Their hearts were full of joy. But we need to understand that we need to guard against and make sure that we don't let personal blessings distract us from our mission that God has given us. Remember, this whole year, the theme of this year is living life on mission. And sometimes we see blessings come into our life and go, wow, God has blessed us. This is so great. And then we focus on the blessings and we forget the mission that God sent us out on. We need to make sure that we keep that mission in focus even when those good times come, even when the blessings come. And yes, things had changed for Esther. Yes, things had changed for Mordecai. But the rest of the people, the Jewish people, their hearts were still broken for their extended family, for those that they cared about. And they needed to keep pursuing what was good for the rest of the people. And so God continued to change their hearts. They weren't going to be satisfied with what they had. They needed to pursue what was good for the greater good of the people around them. And we need to make sure as we go through life, as God calls us to do stuff, we might be going, wow, look at the blessings God has given me as I've stepped out in faith and I've done what He's wanted me to do. That's great, but don't focus on the blessings. Remember the mission He sent you out to do and keep pursuing that mission. We need to keep focused on what God has called us to do. Now you might be going, okay, that's keeping our hearts going in the right direction, Pastor. But what is this whole idea about changing hearts? Well, let's go back and look at what happened with King Xerxes. It says in verse 7, he's replying to the queen. He says, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they hanged him on the gallows. And then look at what the king does. He knows that nothing can be done about the previous edict. It's in the law. It cannot be changed. It's going to happen. But the king's heart is changed towards the people. He realizes that, okay, he gave the wrong person the right to write a law, and he wrote a really bad law, and I can't change that law, but I can do something else that will help. And so the king's heart went from a heart that through most of the story has been apathetic. He hasn't cared. In fact, most of the time that we see in Esther and we hear about King Xerxes, he's drunk. It starts off with him holding this great feast and he's drunk. And so he does something stupid and he has to get rid of one queen and get a new king because he was drunk. And then it says that after Haman was promoted and Haman wrote this law and the whole city was in confusion, he sat down and had a drinking party with Haman. All throughout this, he's been checked out, and all of a sudden his heart is checked in because God is changing his heart. God is saying there's something more than your pleasure of the moment. There's something bigger at stake here. And so God changes King Xerxes' heart. And the impossible always becomes possible when hearts are changed. I want you to think about that. Think about the story that I opened up with of Carrie McWilliams, a blind man who wanted to shoot. Sounds like a dangerous prospect, but when he was 18 is when he actually got his first opportunity to shoot a gun. And he lived near a shooting range where there was training for the military so that they could become proficient, and they had instructors, and they had it open to the public. Anyone could come and learn it. And he showed up at the age of 18 and he told the instructor, I want to learn how to shoot. And the instructor said, you're crazy. But there's nothing in the rule book that says you can't. So you can sit through the class, and after going through the class, at the first day of field activities where they got to shoot, Carrie outshot 2/3 of his class. And they were all sighted, and he's not. And this instructor said, okay, I see that there's potential here. My heart has changed from it's impossible to teach a blind guy to shoot you're one of the better marksmen in my class already. What can you do if you actually have some training? And so he poured his life and his ability into this guy who then went on and has done all this hunting. But it started with a change of heart. As we look at our situations, as we look at people facing impossibilities, the way that God will change those impossibilities is first by changing our hearts. Do we believe that it's impossible, so it's hopeless and we give up? Or do we believe that with God all things are possible, so we look at a situation and go, yeah, I don't understand it, but with God, there's hope in this situation. Do we hold on to that? Or do we let circumstances, the advice of other people, sway our minds and convince us to give up? Or do we let God continue to change our heart, filling it with hope and expectation, with possibilities that he has. You know, it's interesting. Esther knew that this had to happen, so she broke the law for a second time in this story. If you remember, the first time she broke the law was after 3 days of fasting and prayer. And that's where she went before the king without being invited. And if he hadn't extended the golden scepter so that she could touch it, it was a death sentence for her. But she goes, if I live, I live. And then she went and did what God told her to do. But it says here that the second time she came and she fell before the king. She didn't come in dignified like she had the last time. She had her heart overflowing with emotion for her people. And she came in and it says that she fell down weeping, begging him for the lives of her people. And it says there that the king's heart was touched again, and he extended the scepter once more so that she could touch it and bring her request to the king. The question is, have we let our hearts become so set in their ways that we won't let anyone or anything change them? You see, usually when we get that set in our ways, it's based on our ideas or our desires, and so we set up the parameters, we put them in concrete, we put cages around it, and we go, this is it, we're not going to go any further. And that will always hinder us from seeing possibilities and the impossible done. It won't free us to see that. So we need to start with letting God change our hearts. Are our hearts broken for anything? I want you to think about that. Esther and Mordecai put their lives on the line not once, but twice, because their hearts were broken for the plight of their people. Do we have that same kind of compassion for anyone? Are our hearts broken about any situation where we're willing to put everything on the line and say, God, it doesn't matter, you've called me, I'm going to do it, and the results are up to you, so here I go. Do we fall before God weeping over the loss of our loved ones? The fact that they are going through life with no clue about who God is and the joy of having a relationship with Him? Do we weep over those who go to church on a regular basis and have this knowledge about the Bible but don't have any idea what a relationship with God is like? Does it break our hearts? Because if it doesn't, then we need to, first of all, go to God and say, God, we need our heart condition dealt with because our hearts have become hard. God, break our hearts once again for the things that break your hearts. Give us compassion for the people that you have compassion for. Let us look on the crowds around us and let us weep as you did. Let our hearts be broken. So, God overcoming impossibilities starts with changing hearts, and those hearts are our hearts that need to change. That's the one thing I love about prayer. And you've heard me say this before, prayer doesn't change circumstances. So often we go, okay, this prayer is going to change the circumstance, and then when we don't get what we expect, we go, God, where are you? What's going on? Why didn't you hear my prayer? And God goes, I did hear your prayer. Check your heart. Because prayer always changes our heart. Because remember, prayer is communication with God. And whenever we spend time with God, we are changed by His presence. So prayer always should change our hearts. If our hearts aren't changed after we spend time in prayer, we weren't spending time in prayer. We're probably giving God our Christmas list, saying, God, do this, thank you. And then we get mad when He doesn't obey us. Hello, who is God and who is the creation? So we need to let God change our hearts. But that brings us to our second thing, which I want to go back to verse 8 and pick up reading so we can continue along. It says in verse 8, the king is speaking, and he says, now write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's seal. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. Once again, the king is saying there is this impossible situation. But then he gives this opportunity. He gives a glimmer of hope. And verse 9 goes on to say, at once the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan. And they wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps and governors and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. These orders were written in the script of each province and in the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script, in their own language. Mordecai wrote in the name of the king and sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted courier who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. Verse 11. The king's edict granted Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force in any nationality of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and their children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on the day to avenge themselves on their enemies. And then it goes on to say, the couriers riding royal horses raced out, spurred on by the king's command. And the edict was also issued in the citadel of Susa. And I want to stop right there, because that gives us our second point. And as we look at the impossible, sometimes when we see the impossible, we go, okay, there's nothing I can do. We sit down and we kind of give up. We go, God, you're the God of the impossible. Do what you need to do. I'm going to just wait until you take care of the whole situation. And that's not the way God works. God says, you need to have faith in me to do what I can do, but you need to do what you can do. And that's a relationship that works together. And so as we look at this, our second point is this, and that is, God overcoming possibilities leads to surrendered circumstances. When we can't do the impossible, we can always surrender the impossible to God, and that is something we have to do. God won't pry our circumstances out of our fingers. He'll never do that. He always waits for us to say, God, I can't do it. Do what you can do. Or God, I just want you to do what you can do. Maybe we don't get to that point of the impossibility. Esther and Mordecai, they didn't get what they wanted. They wanted the law to be changed so that this attack wouldn't happen. God had bigger plans, and they had to trust God's providence and the fact that he was taking care of it. But they didn't get what they wanted, and they definitely didn't get it when they wanted. They wanted an answer, solution that day when Esther went back into the king's presence without being invited. She wanted the king to say, okay, we're canceling that, we erase it from the books, everyone's safe, it's done. And they didn't get what they wanted. It was going to be about 9 months before they were able to see any answer from God. I want you to think about that, because not just in the impossible situations, but in the everyday situations, we tend to get frustrated when we don't get what we want, when we want, and then we start questioning God, why doesn't he care? God's never functioned by what we want when we want it. Because that would place our will and our desires above God and his desires. And that's not the way it works with God. God's will and God's way always comes first. And so we need to be willing to wait and trust in God's timing, because he knows what he is doing. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we get frustrated. We go, God, why can't you just do something? And he goes, I am. Trust me. And we want things to change according to what our timeline is. And God says, don't worry about your timeline. I've got this under control. I know all the details. And they had to, and we have to wait to see God's results many times. Are we willing to? Are we willing to trust him? Are we willing to surrender to him? Because see, the truth is, all circumstances, impossible and not impossible, all circumstances are surrendered. But for us, as people who have a relationship with God, we get to choose who we surrender those circumstances to. You see, lots of people, when they face tough circumstances, they surrender to popular opinion. Oh, I heard that this is what we should do, so we should do this. And God's going, Man's wisdom is not my wisdom. Listen to my wisdom, not man's wisdom. Or we surrender our circumstances to despair and frustration. Why would we do that? Because we're not thinking it through, and we let emotions take over, and so emotions guide our life. And we need to make sure that we don't do that. Sometimes we surrender to others, the people around us. Oh, I just can't deal with it. You deal with it. And we surrender to them, and sometimes those aren't the best people. It's interesting how closely this lesson reflects our Sunday school lesson from the book of Job. Job had some great advisors, but they had really bad advice. We need to choose carefully who we surrender our situations to. Sometimes we only surrender our situations to us. No one else will do it right. There's no one else I can depend on, so I have to deal with this. So we surrender to us, and we block out everyone else. And when it's all about us, there's a saying that has rattled around in my head ever since I first heard it, and that is, a person wrapped up in themselves makes a very small package indeed. And we are not sufficient to take care of the impossible. So we have to find one who is sufficient to deal with every situation. And since there's only one God, the God of the impossible, he's the one we should surrender to. But are we willing to do that? Surrender means to leave the outcome or results in God's hands. We can't control it. So Esther and Mordecai, they could write a new law saying, okay, it was first written that anyone could kill and attack the Jews with men, women, and children and take whatever they had. And the Jews couldn't do anything about it. Now, they've written where the Jews can protect themselves, but they had to just leave the results in God's hands. For 9 months, they had to wait to see if this new law was going to be enough. Was God sufficient to take care of it? Or and I don't know about you, but when you have to wait 9 months for something, sometimes you start to worry. Sometimes you start to wonder. Sometimes you go, did God even hear me to begin with? And you start to doubt. That's where you have to come back, and you have to know that God is working on it, and you've surrendered it, so don't try to take it back from him. Whenever we surrender something to God, we take it back, we make a bigger mess of it than it was before. We need to leave it in God's hands. And that leaves the outcome and the results in God's hands. In other words, we need to do our best and leave God the rest. It's a partnership with God. That's why we have this relationship. That's why when you bring a prayer request, it's talking with God, not to God. It's talking with God. We share what's on our heart. God communicates back to us. We get this game plan, and then we do what we can. We let God do what he can, and we leave it there. And yes, that was bad English, but it was intentional. We do what we can, and he does what he can. But the whole point is we need to trust God. Trust God and his timing, because his timing is always perfect. I want you to think about it. It was 9 months until this was going to come about. And in a moment, you're going to see what happened in those 9 months, which is a pretty incredible thing. But as I was preparing this, I was reminded of Romans chapter 8, verse 28, where it says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. If we've surrendered our lives to God, and we've been called according to his purpose, we are now children or followers of God. And we've made that choice. He says he'll work all things for the good of those who love him. Now, it might not seem good right now, but in the end, it will be good. We need to trust God. It all comes back to that. Do we know God enough to trust God? Now, I'm reminded of a story it's a sad story. A man was on a voyage, and the ship went down, and he was the only survivor that washed up on a deserted island. And he looked at his situation. He complained that there was no one else there. He complained that he had to do all the work himself. But then he figured, no one else is here. I'm going to have to do it myself. And so he started exploring this little island, and he found supplies that he could build a little shelter out of. He actually made a pretty nice shelter. It had a door on, even though he didn't know why he needed a door. No one else was here. Nor did he major large animals to attack him. And every day he would scan the horizon looking for rescue. Every day there was nothing. And he had this system set out of how he would go around the island throughout the week gathering different foods. So he would never completely deplete any supply. So if he was going to try spearfishing, he would do it in different parts off the shore of this island as he went around so that he didn't spook all the fish. And so he had this system down. And one day he had gone on an extra long journey because he knew there was just the fruit was getting to the perfect ripeness and he wanted to go get it. And he went, and when he came back, as he was coming around the corner, he was stunned to see that his little hut was on fire. And he thought, why would God do this to me? The only thing that I've had that I could put together myself was a shelter, and God's taken the shelter away. It's not fair. And he sat down and he complained and he moaned. And in fact, he cried so much he fell asleep right there in the sand. Well, then after sleeping all night long, he was awoken to the sound of shouting, and he looked up, and there coming towards him across the beach were a bunch of sailors. And in the bay that he could see, there was a boat, and he went, what on earth? How did you find me? I wasn't even trying to signal anyone. And they said, of course you were. We saw your signal fire last night, and we've been following it ever since. His signal fire, his hut burning down. Sometimes we get caught up in the circumstances and we go, God, where can you be in the middle of this? And God goes, hey, remember, I've got this. Trust me. Wait on my time. I've got this, really. Watch what happens. And we need to be willing to do that. So here's a question for you. Will you still choose to serve and trust God even if he chooses not to change your circumstances and your situations according to your timing and your will? Because here's the key. Most of the time, it will never happen in your timing according to your will. It'll always happen according to God's will and in his timing. So are we going to continue to trust him? We need to surrender everything and let God do what God's going to do. That brings us to the last little bit of this story, and I want to pick up in verse 15. Remember, this edict had gone out, things had happened, and it was 9 months of waiting until the day was going to arrive. And it says this in verse 15, Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness, and honor. In every province, in every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many of the other nationalities became Jews because the fear of the Jews had seized them. Now right there, we're given a little indication why God's timing was not immediate. He wanted other people, whether for the wrong motive or not, he wanted other people to turn to the one true God and become Jewish. It wasn't changing your nationality, because you can't, it's a really hard process changing nationality. But by becoming Jewish, they were saying, we now believe in the God of the Jews. So it was an opportunity for the hope of God to spread throughout the world, the known world at that time. That's why God was waiting. That's why it took so long from Esther and Mordecai's point of view, because God had so many people he wanted to be introduced to him. And that's one of the beautiful things. But as we look at this, our third point is this, and that is God overcoming impossibilities always results in a changed standing. The way we relate will always change. Our standing in our relationship to God will always change, because God is doing the impossible. And it's interesting if you notice some of the details here. And I notice it because it's a study I've been working on for a long time. But Haman had wanted what Mordecai got this day. He had wanted the nice robes. He wanted to be honored by the king. He wanted everyone to know that the king favored him. And that's why when he interrupted the king in the middle of the night and the king said, what should I do for one who has pleased me? Haman came up with this great idea. Well, Mordecai didn't ask for any of it, but received all of it. Mordecai, who was just the unseen faithful servant at the king's gate, the one who saved the king's life and never did anything to not honor the king, was finally rewarded because God was changing his standing. And it's interesting, the words that are used here are interesting words because they have deeper meanings. But there's four things that are described here that the Jews were able to experience. They were able to experience prosperity. The word for prosperity there is actually, it's the word light in the Hebrew. And it means that the glow of God's blessing was upon them. People noticed that things were turning in favor of the Jews. And they said, hey, what they have, I need. And that's why so many people became Jews at that time. Do we live in such a way where God's favor is shining on us, that people look at our lives and go, I don't know what they have, but what they have, I need. And so they come and ask, what's different about you? Well, why can you have this attitude when everyone else has this attitude? Why can you be hopeful when everyone else is in despair? Why do you have joy in your heart when no one else seems to smile ever? Well, we need the glow of God's love shining in our life. And we need it in such a way that people will pay attention. But they had this prosperity, or this glow of God's blessing. They had joy, a cheerfulness at their situation, because the situation had changed. God had done the impossible. They also had a gladness, which refers more to their expression of their joy in worship to God. And then they had honor. People wanted to be like them. They have what we we want, so we want to be exactly like them. We'll start dressing like them, we'll speak like them, we'll worship their God because it's working for them and we want that. And so they have these things. So as we look at our changed standings, others will see it and desire what we have. So here's a question. Do people notice you? And do they notice you for the right reasons? Or do you fit into that old saying that I have to admit I borrowed from my dad, and that is, the kingdom of God is righteousness, peace, and a long and sour face. Because all we do is walk around and we're grumpy and we criticize and complain about everything. You know, it was too hot in the sanctuary today. No, it was too cold in the sanctuary today. Well, they have fans. They couldn't turn the fans on. And the singing was too loud. No, it was too soft. It was too contemporary. It was too traditional. And who wants to hang out with a bunch of people like that? Or, it's a beautiful day today. Yeah, but it's too sunny. Okay, in the middle of winter, it's too cloudy and cold. The people who complain all the time, literally complain all the time, even when circumstances change to give them what they said they quote-unquote wanted, they complain. Or do other people notice you, not because you're grumpy, but because you're just weird? I don't mean weird in a good way, I just mean weird. Like, ew, keep my children away from them weird. Because that's not what we're talking about here. We're supposed to let God change our standing so that others will see and desire what we have. Not desire to be us, because that would be ridiculous, but desire what we have. Why do they have joy that seems to govern their life? I need that kind of joy. Why do they have peace that protects their heart and mind no matter what they face? I need that kind of peace. And you could go through these. Do people notice us for that? Why do they have a love for each other that is just genuine and overflows, and then we're not even part of them and they love on us too? Why do they have this love? It's because of our relationship with God, and we've surrendered everything to Him, and we're letting Him do what He wants. Do we present that? You see, this happens so that others in our story would become Jews and turn to the one true living God. It should happen in our lives so that others will want to come discover what we have so that they can be introduced to the God of eternity. The God who loves them, the God who can change everything. You see, the God of the impossible is on our side. So we should never lose hope. Never. Some of you who've been around this area for a while, you'll remember the name Dave Huffman. He was a teacher over at Priest River High School for a long time. And then God got a hold of his life, and he committed his life to Jesus Christ, and he responded to God's call in his life, and he pastored the Priest River Baptist Church for a long time. You might remember that the last 3 years of his life were different because he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He was given a life expectancy of 6 months. And whenever you talked to him, he had a smile on his face. Whenever you talked to him, there was joy overflowing from him. People were completely confused. You've been given a death sentence, Dave. Why isn't it affecting your life? He goes, well, God's got it in control, and guess what? God's going to heal me. They looked at him. You have 6 months to live. Yeah, God's going to heal me. Don't worry about it. And that many times led to a discussion, well, why do you believe that God's going to heal me? He goes, well, one day I'll step into eternity and I have a completely healed, perfect body. God will heal me. I don't know if He's going to heal me here on earth or in heaven, but it will happen. And they were just blown away by the fact that he had this peace. His wife, Vicki, she didn't have quite the same peace all the time. She got frustrated, she got mad. But Dave, for the most part, kept a really even keel. Even when his body weight dropped in half and he didn't have the strength to get up anymore. He never doubted God. He had this peace and joy in his life. And it drew people to him going, how can you go through this? A death sentence. And yes, God gave him not 6 months, but 2 extra years after that. But it was 2 years. Why was God so long in healing his body? Because yes, he did finally die of pancreatic cancer, but he stepped into glory with a completely healed and perfect body. And I remember talking to people at the memorial service and just in the community, and they asked me this question, why would God let him suffer like that for 2 years? Why didn't you just take him quicker so he didn't have to suffer? If he wasn't going to heal him, why didn't you make him suffer? And I said, he didn't make him suffer. He allowed it so that you could see the difference God makes in someone's life. You're like, what? Yeah, you remember the joy that Dave had? Yeah, the peace? Yeah, that's because of his relationship with Jesus Christ. Do you have that relationship? Because you can have that relationship. And I was able to witness to people because of that. So as we look at circumstances and situations, as we look at the impossible, and we wonder about God's timing, sometimes the timing is there so that others will be inspired to turn to God themselves. We may never see the big picture until we stand in glory, but you know what? God's got it. Trust him. And let him deal with the impossible while you do your best at what he's called you to do. Esther and Mordecai did their best. They wrote a great way to protect the people. And then they had to wait. And God did the rest. As we wrap up this morning, I want to ask you a simple question. Are you facing a situation where you're starting to lose hope? You've been dealing with it so long that you don't know if there is any possibility of a different outcome. Well, today God's saying, yes, I'm the God of the impossible. Trust me. Maybe you're just frustrated and you're looking for other answers because things aren't going according to your schedule and your plan, and God's saying, I've got this. Trust me. Wait and see what I can do. And so today God's reminding us, and God doesn't remind us of things so that we can bottle them up and ignore them. He reminds us so that we can respond. And so at this time I'm going to ask you to take a moment to bow your heads and close your eyes. I ask you to do that so that you can just focus in on what God's saying. And as we've talked about impossible situations and the fact that God can change them, your situation might be impossible, or maybe it's just a huge challenge and you've been giving up, you've been frustrated, you've been wanting to deal with it yourself or to go to what popular opinion says you should do, and yet today God is saying, trust me. And you're struggling, can I trust my Lord and Savior?